This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has reached out to Pope Francis, asking for his help to bring about a peaceful solution to the crisis in Venezuela. Maduro is facing increasing international pressure to resign from office 2 weeks after opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself to be Venezuela's interim president. Guaidó made the announcement on January 23rd after speaking to U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, who offered support from the Trump administration. Since then, a growing number of countries have openly recognized Guaidó's claim to the presidency. On Monday, Austria, Britain, Denmark, France, Germany, Spain, and Sweden all voiced support for Guaidó after Maduro rejected their calls to hold new elections. But Italy blocked a European Union statement recognizing Guaidó. Ireland and Greece have called for new elections, but have not recognized Guaidó's claim to the presidency.
Meanwhile, the Venezuelan opposition and the United States have rejected an offer by Mexico and Uruguay to host talks between the two sides. On Friday, Vice President Mike Pence spoke in Miami and ruled out any negotiations.
This is no time for dialogue. This is time for action. And the time has come to end the Maduro dictatorship once and for all.
That was Vice President Mike Pence. On Sunday, President Trump appeared on CBS's Face the Nation and said sending U.S. troops to Venezuela remains an option. He was interviewed by Margaret Brennan.
What would make you use the U.S. military in Venezuela? What's the national security
Well, I don't want to say
interest?
that, but certainly it's something that's on the, it's an option.
Would you personally negotiate with Nicolas Maduro to convince him to exit?
Well, he has requested a meeting, and I've turned it down because we're very far along in the process. You have a young and energetic gentleman, but you have other people within that same group that have been very, very, if you talk about democracy, it's sort of really democracy in action.
While the U.S. is rejecting negotiations, the impact of the sweeping new U.S. sanctions on Venezuela are being felt across the country. The Wall Street Journal's reporting oil tankers are beginning to pile up off the Venezuelan coast as Venezuela struggles to pump and ship oil. To talk more about Venezuela, we're joined by two guests. Miguel Tinker-Salas is a Venezuelan-born professor who teaches at Pomona College in Claremont, California. He's the author of The Enduring Legacy: Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela, and Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. David Smaldi is a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, where his focus is Venezuela. He's a professor of sociology at Tulane University. He runs the blog Venezuelan Politics and Human Rights and is co-editor of the compilation Venezuela's Bolivarian Democracy, Participation, Politics, and Culture under Chavez. He lived and worked in Venezuela since 1992. We want to welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Miguel Tinker-Salas, why don't we begin with you? Can you summarize what's happened so far in Venezuela and what you think is about to happen?
Well, the first thing we all know is that Guaidó declared himself the interim president, immediately recognized by the U.S., by the countries of the Group of Lima, and then by many of the European countries. And I think many in the opposition thought that by now Maduro would have fallen. They overestimate their power, and they underestimate consistently the fact that he may still have power among sectors of the population. Granted, not many, but still has significant power and still has the power of the military. We saw a dueling protest over the weekend, pretty impressive both sides. The opposition in Las Mercedes, an upper middle class neighborhood, the Chavista protest in Avenida Bolivar in the center of the city. Immediately thereafter, we saw an effort at spinning which march had the biggest amount of people. Again, part of this position that either side can still draw out a population. The fear I have is is that we increasingly continue with a policy of winner take all, that there is no effort at negotiation, that all the marbles are being put on international recognition, ousting Maduro, and in the long term, there is no recognition of what does this mean for the country in terms of its social fabric, its political culture, and going forward if there's no negotiated agreement on that process.
I'd like to ask David Smiley to give us his perspective, especially in light of the fact that the attempts to change the Bolivarian revolution did not start yesterday. There's been a constant tension between the United States, first during the Chavez regime and now during the Maduro era, to change the direction of Venezuelan society.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think clearly there's been long-term tensions between the United States and Venezuela, but I would urge listeners to not reduce the current situation to that. I think what happened with Juan Guaido declaring himself president or interim president was in the works for a long time. It was not dictated from the United States. Clearly there was coordination, but it's something that is a plausible reading of the Constitution, given the fact that so many Venezuelans in the international community do not see the May elections as having been legitimate. And so I think, it's a difficult situation. I am very worried of the fact that the United States has taken such a high profile in this right from the beginning. And I think the move to sanctions this past week, oil sanctions, I think is very difficult. As Miguel just said, I think the U.S. and the opposition thought that the very day that Guaido declared himself president, that the military would step in. And in fact, there was a very long period of silence from them, but they've backed Maduro now, and so they have more strength than people think. And I think, unless there's some sort of change or transition in the coming weeks or a month or so, the sanctions, these oil sanctions, are going to hurt the population more than they hurt the government, and are probably going to allow the Maduro government to simply ratchet down its authoritarian project.
And Miguel Tinker-Salas, in terms of this whole issue of the oil sanctions, and the pictures now of tankers supposedly lined up, unable to transport oil, but isn't the real problem that any country that wants to buy the oil, the issue of the currency that they use, whether they will then be sanctioned by the United States as a result of doing transactions with Venezuela, that's the problem, the financial squeeze that the U.S. is putting on the country right now?
Yes, it is. And many of those tankers are in the Gulf Coast, and they haven't reached port because, again, they're concerned about who will pay for the oil. And the buyers are concerned, if they pay the Venezuelan government, will they get sanctioned? And again, this is the danger of those sanctions. Sanctions essentially pass the pain on to the population, not to the government. Sanctions did not work in Cuba. Sanctions did not work in Iran. Instead, it increases the suffering for the average Venezuelan. And it's a tragedy that that's part of this strategy, that it's a waiting game to see in large measure the extent to which the sanctions will have an impact on the population. And someone is betting on the fact that people will be suffering and will turn their wrath on the government. They may, in fact, turn their wrath on the other side, that is the one who is imposing the sanctions and cause these. So again, it's a very dangerous proposition to continue to utilize sanctions because the people pay the price.
I wanted to ask David Smiley about the sanctions and the U.S. intervention at every level, strangling the Venezuelan economy. Bloomberg reported on January 25th, Nicolas Maduro's embattled Venezuelan regime, desperate to hold on to the dwindling cash pile it has abroad, was stymied in its bid to pull $1.2 billion worth of gold out of the Bank of England. The Bank of England's decision to deny Maduro officials withdrawal requests comes after top U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton, lobbied their UK counterparts to help cut off the regime from its overseas assets. And then On January 29th, Bloomberg reported Secretary of State Mike Pompeo took another step to bolster Guaido as Venezuela's interim president, certifying the National Assembly leader has control over key government bank accounts based in the United States. Pompeo determined Guaido has authority over the nation's accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and other U.S.-insured banks. Do you think it is too simple to compare this to Nancy Pelosi going out into the streets as House Speaker, the equivalent of what Juan Guaido was, President of the National Assembly, with thousands of people announcing herself president, and then countries of the world, particularly colonial powers, announcing they recognize her as president, and then those countries where U.S. money is saying we're giving our money over to her? David?
Yeah, I do think that would be too simplistic, because I think, this is a plausible interpretation. I don't think it's a Loctite interpretation, because the Constitution of Venezuela doesn't have clear norms for this type of situation. But it's a plausible interpretation that if there's not a president, if there's not a legitimate president, it will be the National Assembly president that steps as an interim president. And I think, if countries around the world are not seeing Maduro as legitimate president, if they're recognizing Guaido because of these sort of constitutional norms of succession, then I think it's plausible. I think that these assets would be given over to Guaido. I think it's a very dangerous game, because I think Guaido, what never gets mentioned is that Guaido has no way of getting this money into Venezuela. No, it's going to be in some sort of escrow account. He doesn't have the opposition doesn't have any parallel central bank, and so in the meantime, there's going to be a real difficulty in Venezuela in terms of the lack of funds coming in.
Wouldn't it be the vice president who would take over if the vice president Maduro was pushed out?
No, my understanding constitutionally, it would be the National Assembly president.
I wanted to ask you, in terms of the potential for civil war in the country. Supposedly, Maduro has called on the people's militias to become more active now. He said that weapons would be available to them from the military. What's the potential for, given the fact that no matter what the size of his supporters are, they are clearly dedicated and determined, for the potential for Venezuela to slip into civil war?
I think it's something that's not considered enough, because I think this very clearly could happen. I mean, the opposition itself does not have arms, but you could clearly have some sort of faction of the military rebel against Maduro and others stay loyal, and that could end up causing a civil war. If that were to happen, it would be a really difficult situation, because there's not just the armed forces, but there's also colectivos, there's other armed actors, there's also, paramilitaries that are in Venezuela, there are armed gangs in the areas that have gold, and so that could be real chaos. I mean, there's this simplistic assumption that just pressuring Guaido and trying to lure the military or just pressuring Maduro and trying to lure the military to step in is somehow going to lead to democracy. And actually, it's just as likely that the military steps in and tries to put one of its own in power, or put somebody that's more amenable to it in power, and the whole situation can also break into a civil war.
Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue with our guests, David Smaldi, Senior Fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, and Miguel Tinker-Salas, Professor at Pomona College in Claremont, California, talking about the crisis right now in Venezuela.
Miguel Tinker-Salas, I'd like to ask you something that doesn't normally get asked in most of the commercial media accounts of what's going on there. What went wrong in the Bolivarian Revolution? Given the fact that you had a situation where, under Chavez, at least, the Chavez government was deeply popular, despite the opposition of the U.S. government. But since Maduro has come in, he's clearly lost the government has clearly lost enormous amounts of popularity. What happened from your perspective?
Well, I think that the cracks were evident even when Chavez was alive. We saw neighborhoods like Petare voting less and less for Chavez, 23 de enero, others as well. And Maduro inherits that process and also inherits it at a time in which the price of oil was declining significantly, and at the same time in which you had to maintain a series of social programs that had extended it, overreached in many ways, but also you have to add mismanagement, economic improvisation, corruption, their inability to control the exchange rate. Then you add sanctions to that as well that make it more difficult to renegotiate debt and to purchase capital goods to renovate the oil industry. And you add the fact that you're also trying to process heavy crude and make a profit on it at a lower margin. Those are all the components. So that there is a tremendous amount of responsibility that the Maduro government and those forces bear. I also would have to add sanctions. You cannot exclude the fact that sanctions aggravated the crisis as well. And in many ways, you also had an economic war by many sectors of the private sector who were refusing to participate. And you had, again, all those components coming together at a time in which Maduro didn't prove to be the master politician that Hugo Chavez had been. In many ways, he was forced to negotiate arrangements with his own party and supporters, and that complicated the political and economic process in the country and aggravated already shortages of food, shortages of medicine, compelling many millions of people to leave the country.
In a recent interview on Fox Business, National Security Advisor John Bolton openly said U.S. oil companies could benefit from what's happening in Venezuela. This is what he said.
We're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. You know, Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the Troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of the United States.
So that's Bolton on Fox. David Smaldi of the Washington office on Latin America. Can you talk about this? The U.S., despite the widespread sanctions, has exempted U.S. oil companies. The significance of the message of Bolton right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, anybody that studies Venezuela knows that Venezuela, you know, one of its main characteristics is that it's a petro economy. It's a petrostate. It has the largest proven reserves of oil in the world. And that makes it of extraordinary interest to the United States, to Europe, to other countries. And these interests are always going to be involved in what's going on. It doesn't surprise me at all that Bolton would be talking about this and trying to sell the administration's approach to big oil, in part because these sanctions are impacting some of these oil interests on the Gulf Coast, at least the refining interests, are you know, going to have to replace some of this heavy crude that's coming in. And so I think Bolton's trying to sell this, and yeah, these interests are always involved in anything that happens with Venezuela.
And I want to ask you about the significance of Elliott Abrams now being the special envoy to Venezuela, the history of Abrams in Central and South America. He's got a long, sordid history in terms of his involvement. He provided military support to the dictator in Guatemala, Efraín Ríos Montt, who was later convicted of genocide. He was responsible for, was involved in during the Iran-Contra years and was found guilty of lying to Congress about the Reagan administration's efforts to provide aid to the Contras in Nicaragua despite a congressional ban. So Abrams has a long history especially to leaders in Latin America. They all know who he is and they all know what he does. So him coming in at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most disturbing things that has happened in the past couple of weeks is the naming of Elliott Abrams as envoy for Venezuela. I think, you know, oftentimes U.S. presidential administrations do things that, you know, they don't seem to really be aware of the optics and that really set off alarm bells in the region. I think in this case, this is the point that really told me that the Trump administration was sort of making Venezuela part of its foreign policy. No, it almost seems like a sort of make America great again type foreign policy. As Elliott Abrams, as you mentioned, was the architect of one of the darkest periods of U.S. Involvement in Latin America, and that is Ronald Reagan's Central American policy in the 1980s. Not only was he involved in Iran-Contra, he was also involved in repeatedly denying the El Mozote massacre. And so I think, having him there speaks clearly to everyone in Latin America and speaks clearly to those of us who have watched Latin America and studied it for a long time, that the U.S.'s intentions here are regime change. The U.S.'s intentions here are to really impose itself on this situation. I think that's really unfortunate. I think it really clouds the water and makes the situation much more difficult.
Professor Tinker Salas, your response to Elliott Abrams, the point person on Venezuela now.
But I think it doesn't speak clearly to the opposition in Venezuela. They have met with Elliott Abrams. They have connected with him. They have not condemned his nomination. The same thing with John Bolton. Why doesn't Guaidó simply say to the U.S. president, we don't want troops on the table as an option. We don't want a foreign invasion. We do not want U.S. Marines. We don't want John Bolton talking about how he's going to benefit U.S. companies from our oil. We don't want Marco Rubio talking about the conditions in Venezuela. We don't want John Bolton making us part of your geopolitical arrangement for the Troika of tyranny and trying to insert us in what you want to revive as a Cold War in Latin America. And we don't want Mr. Elliott Abrams running U.S. policy for Venezuela because we don't want his bloodstained hands on our country. But again, we don't hear that from the opposition, and that's what's troubling about the context in which they're operating, because they don't want to talk about this being a coup.
Well, on Friday, National Security Advisor John Bolton threatened to send President Maduro to the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo. He made the remark during a radio interview with Hugh Hewitt.
Ceausescu and Mussolini met bad ends. Idi Amin and Baby Doc Duvalier did not. Is that the choice facing Maduro right now?
Well, I tweeted yesterday, I wish him a long, quiet retirement on a pretty beach far from Venezuela. And the sooner he takes advantage of that, the sooner he's likely to have a nice, quiet retirement on a pretty beach rather than being in some other beach area like Guantanamo.
That is the U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton. David Smaldi, your response.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly he's posturing. They're trying to put the pressure on Maduro, trying to get Maduro to step aside. I don't think that's going to do it. I think there actually has to be some sort of process of negotiation, some sort of process of transitional justice that's going to make it amenable, because all these people have very high exit costs. I mean, a lot of them, are compromised by human rights violations, by corruption, and they fear that, they'll end up being extradited or face something worse in Venezuela. And so there's got to be some sort of transitional justice process that'll be involved to make it actually attractive for these guys.
And Miguel Tinker Salas, I'd like to ask you about in terms of the effort to marshal international support from different countries for one or the other side. Clearly, two major countries, China and Russia, have not been supportive. And of course, China is a huge creditor to Venezuela, something like $60 billion in loan that China has extended to Venezuela over the past decade or so. Could you talk about the battle for the hearts and minds of the world leaders in other parts of the country? In other parts of the world.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that clearly. The opposition in 2017, after the failure of the negotiations in the Dominican Republic, opted for an international strategy. They gave up in many ways on the electoral process in Venezuela and began to see the way of getting Maduro out was to try to consolidate power among a rising conservative force in South America, hence the Grupo de Lima, also with Luis Almagro in the OAS, and then also winning over European countries countries and the U.S. The election of Donald Trump facilitated that, and that was obviously their strategy. Now the government of Venezuela has the support of Russia and China, who are heavily invested in the country's oil industry and in terms of Russia militarily. So again, and you also have other countries. In Turkey, you're hearing today Venezuela, tomorrow Turkey, South Africa. It's funny when all you see those maps that show all the supporters, they always leave Africa out. I always find that interesting. But the reality is that Venezuela is being inserted into potentially an international conflict. And it's being done so in large part because, again, it's been signaled as the first member of the Troika of tyranny that must fall, and then Cuba will be next. The Wall Street Journal article earlier this week, in which talks about that first will be Venezuela, then it'll be Cuba, and then pressure will be applied to Nicaragua. And that's unfortunate because that emboldens both positions in Venezuela and emboldens the opposition for a zero-sum game. In other words, all or nothing strategy, which I think in the long run will prove harmful for the country. The only solution here has to be some mediated, negotiated process, and then the offer by Mexico and by Uruguay and by the United Nations General Secretary and the Vatican needs to be considered.
Well, let's talk about that Wall Street Journal piece last week with the U.S.-backed effort to oust Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, just the first step in the Trump administration's plan to reshape Latin America, with Cuba next on its radar. According to the report, the U.S. is planning to announce new measures against Cuba in the coming weeks, including new sanctions and restoring Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. The moves could severely hamper foreign investment in Cuba. According to the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. then plans to target Nicaragua. In November, National Security Advisor John Bolton dubbed the three nations the Troika of tyranny. Last week, Vice President Mike Pence said President Trump is, quote, not a fan of U.S. interventions abroad, except for, quote, in this hemisphere. David Smildy.
Yeah, I have no doubt that this, what's going on in Venezuela is part of a larger strategy of the neocons that have now inhabited the Trump administration. But I would suggest that I think, it's good to take Venezuela on its own. And I think, simply reacting to this, I'm no fan of the Trump administration's foreign policy, but I think we have to look at Venezuela and prioritize the people there. I don't think that enemy of my enemy is my friend, or enemy of my enemy gets a critical buy is a proper response. I don't think that's a progressive response. I think it dehumanizes people. I think Venezuelans have to be prioritized. In every case, I think you have to look at the situation, look at who's suffering, who has power, who needs to change, and criticize and comment as needed. And so I think in the case of Venezuela, I don't think that the actions of the Trump administration should be held against the Venezuelan opposition in their struggles. And I think, Maduro's legacy and Maduro's record, I think, is very clear to everybody. I think he's been an absolute disaster in Venezuela in the past few years, and now he's become a very undemocratic disaster. And I think that's really what's got to be prioritized here. I mean, I think, the Trump foreign policy is very worrying, but I think we have to treat context and people as ends in themselves.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us. David Smildy, Senior Fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, and Miguel Tinker-Salas, Professor at Pomona College in Claremont, California. Of course, we will continue to cover what's happening in Venezuela. You can go to our hour with Venezuelan Foreign Minister Arriaza, and also our hour with Alan Nairn on the appointment of Elliott Abrams that we did last week. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the trial of El Chapo and the information that has come out that should inform President Trump when he talks about national security. Stay with us.